We've got a lot to be thankful for this morning. Despite some of the technical difficulties, the men in the back have really done a great job of ensuring that things go smoothly. I want to thank Tosin and Ian for helping pass out the handouts for today's class. If you guys don't have a handout and you would like one, just raise your hand and we will make sure that you get one. I also want to thank Robert. He has quietly and graciously been helping me get the handouts printed each week, even though I tend to email them late Saturday night, as well as getting the PowerPoint set up for me. Okay, so we are going to be in our 7th class today, lesson 7. We're looking at chapter 4, verses 8 through 31. We've got quite a bit of text to make it through today, and there's a lot of content within this. And you'll remember that when we finished up our class on Wednesday, we had just gone through a section at the beginning of chapter 4 where Paul is focusing on the idea of being sons and heirs to God through Christ. If you look at verses 6 and 7, and because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. That's really kind of setting up the text that we're going to be looking at today. They're no longer slaves. The Galatians who were in bondage are no longer in bondage under Christ and in God. And it's so important for them to remember that, and Paul's really going to focus on that. And this idea of no longer being enslaved and now being free in Christ is applicable to anybody who would read this, whether they would be Jewish or a Gentile, no matter the background. There's some sort of slavery that you're leaving as you come into Christ. And we're going to see that in our text today. So let's take a look at verses 8 through 11. I also want to mention that I love how well Daniel's lesson is going to be applicable to our class today, because the question that the Galatians are dealing with is, who are they as children of God? And they're going to have a decision to make that we're going to come to here in a little bit of, am I going to be a child of God, a descendant, a child of promise, or am I going to be a child of flesh, which is what we're going to see towards the end of our text here in chapter 4. So let's look at verses 8 through 11. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. So as we get into this, I want to start off with a question. Before the Galatians knew God, what was their status? We just touched on it in kind of our intro here. Shout it out, Brian. Yeah, idolatry. And I think specifically when you look at the region of Galatia, they were, at this time, heavily influenced by Greco-Roman religion, which would have been, the Greek pantheon. In Acts, you see, and I think is either Iconium or Lystra, I believe. They actually mistook Paul and Barnabas for Hermes and Zeus. And I believe there may have even been a temple of Zeus in one of the cities that they were at. So there's heavy influences of Greco-Roman culture, as well as Celtic, or if you've heard of the Gauls. The Gauls were the nations that came down from the north and invaded this region as well. So they had a heavy influence with their religion also. So they were enslaved to idols before they knew God. And we see here that they're also abandoning their adoption. We saw on Wednesday's class that they're adopted as sons, heirs to God. What are they abandoning their adoption for? To become slaves of what? So they've left slavery to become free, and they're now going back into slavery. Well, I think that they're abandoning that. So Paul's warning them that, look, you've been free. You're no longer slaves, enslaved to these idols. Why would you turn back and become slaves again? But what is it that they're turning back to become slaves of? The law, exactly. They're turning away from the law of Christ, the freedom that they have in Christ, to become enslaved to the law. So one form of bondage to another. So we see the law of the flesh, Judaism with these Judaizing teachers. Okay, which Paul actually notes. So Paul's equating their status as pagans to their status as under these Judaizers who are, as he describes, weak, worthless, elementary principles of the world. And then at the end of this section, in verse 11, Paul says, I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. What specifically was Paul afraid of here? What was his fear? We've kind of hinted at this in some of our previous classes. Yeah, Brian?
Paul's fear is that the word of God that he'd bestowed upon them and given to them, that they would betray it and leave it for another gospel, which he said was not another gospel, and that they would be accursed. So all his effort and their original faith that they had was all in vain because they departed the faith.
Exactly, yeah. Paul's afraid that they're going to turn back to slavery, just what he was talking about. He's afraid that they're going to leave the faith, that his efforts on them in bringing them the gospel were wasted, and that they're no longer heirs according to promise. I think it's important to notice that. Paul tells them that you're heirs according to promise, according to the Spirit. And he's afraid that if they continue this route, that they're going to lose that inheritance. They're no longer going to be heirs to that promise. And therefore, they're going to be cursed under the law and abandon their blessing of the faith, which is what we saw in chapter 3, looking at the curse under the law and the blessings of Abraham, and also in 4, verse 7. So any thoughts or comments for those first 3 verses? Brian?
One verse that I thought would be important to look at is verse 9, but now do you come to know God, but rather be known by God. A very important principle or part of being a Christian, a child of God, is to know God, and in turn for God to know us. And the question becomes, how do we know God? In 1 John 3, it's like a parallel to how do we know we love God. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Here, 1 John 3 is, if you know God when you obey his commandments. And likewise, look at my little margin here, 1 Corinthians 8:3, when you love God, meaning you obey God, you are known by God, and both of those are incorporated here. To know God and to be known by God is to obey God and to love him. And what they're doing is they're departing the faith. They're no longer obedient to God, if you will, and therefore in danger of no longer be known by him. And they're in danger of no longer knowing God, our Father.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I got ahead of myself, and I actually skipped over that part in my notes here. And I really want to kind of focus just for another minute here on what it means to be known by God. And we see that obedience is a part of that on behalf of the individual. God recognized them as his heirs. He recognized them as his sons. And we read the verse earlier, and because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. God had sent them the Spirit of his Son into their hearts, and he knew them as his sons. But it's important to note that this isn't a one-way relationship. The relationship that they thought they had with these false idols that they were enslaved to, it was a one-way relationship. It was them giving. There was no return. There was nothing on the other side to love them back, to recognize them, to sacrifice for them. And that's what they were leaving under God. Okay. Any other comments on that? And we'll move on. All right. Let's take a look at verses 12 through 15. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first, and though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. All right, so here we see Paul pleading with the Galatians to become like him as he has with them. What do you think that means? What is Paul saying here? That he wants the Galatians to become like him, just as he did. Think back. I think this is kind of there's a couple of ways to answer this. In a broader sense, think back to who Paul was before he was known as Paul. Yeah, he was a Pharisee. He was under the law. He was a slave to the law. Paul left that enslavement under the law to become and to live like a Gentile outside of the law. So in a sense, I think he's saying that. But also, we've talked about in the past that Paul, and I'll just quote. So from 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23, Paul is talking to his audience saying that he would become anything that he needed to in order to progress the gospel, right? As long as it didn't go against God's word. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew. I think I transcribed this incorrectly. Let me just turn to it in my Bible. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So Paul's entreating them, he's pleading to them to follow his example in becoming what he needed to become in order to advance the gospel, for one another, for himself. Does that make sense? And I'm not sure. I think there are the couple of different ways that you can answer that question. I kind of lean towards that maybe in context what he may have been referring to was how he left his enslavement under the law to become and to live like a Gentile outside the law. I think that's really the focus there and what he's trying to get across to them. Ian?
Yeah, I think what we see here is Paul just adapting to his surroundings and really putting himself in a position to identify with the people that he's preaching to, understanding their way of life, why they think the way that they think, the struggles that they go through each day. And for every demographic, that's a little bit different. For the Jews, it was different. For the Pharisees, it was different for the Gentiles, and specifically the Galatians. It would have been different from the Romans. And so he's just understanding these people on a more intimate level so that he can help them to understand the truth a little bit easier.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then Paul also recognizes that this isn't a personal affront to him. He mentions in verse 12, you did me no wrong. Paul recognizes that the actions of the Galatians, they're not a personal affront to him on a personal level. In fact, when he had previously come to them, he notes that they treated him as though he were an angel from God, even as Christ Jesus, in verses 13 and 14. And in verse 13, Paul mentions that there was a bodily ailment or an illness that was the reason that he had come to first preach to them in the first place. I want to think about that. How could an ailment or an illness lead to Paul preaching to them? I don't think we specifically saw this necessarily noted in Acts when we were going through that. But how could that lead to Paul being of service to them?
I guess potentially it could have left him there a little bit longer, maybe. Instead of moving on to another place, he stayed there longer.
I think that's part of it. I think what he's saying here is that the reason that he ended up there was because of his illness in the first place. So this is kind of guesswork. If you look at a topographical map of the region of Galatia is much higher in elevation than a lot of the surrounding areas, especially along the coastline, obviously, when you're down at sea level. Most of Galatia, through the area that he was in, varied from about 7,000 to 10,000 feet in elevation. So it's a much different climate. It's a lot drier. It's possible that this illness of his, he may have gone up to that higher elevation to help with the symptoms of it. It's also possible that whatever this ailment or illness was, perhaps he felt that in order to receive treatment, he would have gone into that region in order for that treatment as well. I think either of those are possible answers in what he's noting here. In any case, Paul didn't waste the opportunity to spread the gospel. He didn't let his ailment prevent him from spreading the word, even though it may not have been his original plan to go through this region to begin with at the time that he did. And he also notes that despite his ailment, the Galatians were receptive and welcoming to Paul, which I think is maybe noteworthy. If this was a sickness or a disease of some sort, like malaria or something like that, there would have been a stigma around that. And more often than not, those people that were suffering from that would have kind of been pushed out to the outskirts and kind of shunned. But he says that they welcomed him. They were receptive to him. And I think that that's worth mentioning, to see that the hearts of the Galatians when they were with Paul was commendable. And in verse 15, Paul goes as far to mention that if possible, they would have gouged out their eyes and given them to him. And I think maybe there's some hyperbole there, but why would they have gone to such lengths to be so accommodating to Paul, you think?
Oh, didn't you say that they thought he was something holy when he appeared?
I think that his point there was that they were treating him so well and that they were so welcoming to him. It was as if he were an angel. Not that they mistook him necessarily for an angel, but that's how well they treated him when he was with them. Let's look back at at the beginning of verse 15, Paul asked them, "What has become of your blessedness?" And I think that that's kind of tied into this point at the end of 15. The word here used for blessedness or blessing in some translations literally means a declaration of blessedness. They recognize their own blessings. So they are, in a sense, congratulating themselves or celebrating their own blessedness. And they would have done anything for Paul because they recognized that the blessings that they received because of Paul's teaching them the gospel. Does that make sense? So they recognized their own status after receiving the gospel which Paul presented to them. Ian?
Yeah, and that ties into Daniel's lesson this morning. You know, it's being just and righteous in God's eyes. You're in essence blessing yourself or recognizing yourself as blessed because you're following the commands of God.
Yeah, exactly. And in turn, that tied into their relationship with Paul. It was a loving relationship. And he asked them, what has happened to that sense of blessing? Because they apparently don't have that any longer, following these false teachers. Any thoughts in verses 12 through 15? Comments, questions? Okay. Let's take a look at 16 through 18. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you. So in verse 16, Paul asks them, if he is now their enemy because of the honest accounting of their current state. And then we see in verse 15 that when Paul left them, they were zealous. They recognized their blessings in Christ. They had a good relationship with Paul because of having received the gospel. And something has changed since then. And in verse 16, Paul wants to know, am I now your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? So what do you think? Is Paul their enemy because of the honest accounting that he has given them? I think to help me kind of understand this, the passages that I've been putting up on the screen are from the ESV. I want to just look at the New King James and New American Standard real quick in verses 17 and 18. Paul says, I zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you that they may be zealous for them, but it is good to be zealous and a good thing always, and not only when I am present with you. And then in the NASB, they eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will seek them. But it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you. I think what we're seeing here when Paul asks them if he has become their enemy, he's contrasting that with verses 14 and 15 regarding their relationship with Paul. Paul went from being being as an angel of God to them to being their enemy because of the truth that he's telling them. And so I think in a sense, it is almost as if in their eyes he is an enemy to them because he's pointing out their disobedience and defiance of the gospel. And then he's going to highlight here the true nature of those that are coming in to steal them away from the gospel that we're going to see in 17 and 18. Does that make sense? So in 17 and 18, it helped me to kind of see these translations side by side. This idea of they were coming in to zealously court the Galatians. They eagerly sought after them. And their motives were not good and they were not commendable. It kind of reminds me of almost like college recruiting for sports or something like that. The reason that the false teachers were coming in to court them was for selfish gain. And they do so to gain the favor of the Galatians. So if they could persuade the Galatians, if they were able to court the Galatians to follow their own instruction, their false teaching that they need to look towards the law of Moses and the law of flesh, then it would be as though the Galatians were becoming their disciples, right? They're no longer a disciple of Christ, but they're followers of these Judaizing teachers. And I think that this sheds light on why we see them discredit Paul's credentials back in what we saw in chapters 1 and 2. Why did Paul have to defend his apostleship? It's because he was under attack from these false teachers. If they were able to alienate the Galatians from Paul and other teachers that were like-minded, then that means that they would be they would separate them from the influence of Paul. They would separate them from the influence of when they first received the gospel. If they could alienate them, then they could pull them away from the gospel to be their own followers. So Paul goes on to say in verse 18 that it's good to be zealous for good things, not just when Paul is present. The zeal that the Galatians had when Paul was with them, that was a great thing. They were zealous. They recognized their own blessings. But once Paul left, they needed to be consistent with that. They needed to stay true and to still see their right status under the law of Christ. Any thoughts through that passage? Michael?
That last part in verse 18, it makes me think, I mean, it might not be the best parallel, but it makes me think of, how easy it is for me to be zealous for God when I'm assembled here, versus when I'm going about my week, and so, there's an application there that we need to carry, the zeal that we have here in worship, and we're in here studying and around our brothers and sisters and edified and encouraged by them, but we have to hold on to that when we're on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian?
Yeah, I think Michael touched on something actually really, really powerful there. You put anything where the word they is in 17, anything in our lives that eagerly seeks our attention and takes us away from what our true focus should be on, which is on God. And none of it, social media, movies, false idols, are seeking our attention commendably. They don't really want us. They're just taking us away from the truth. And so I guess being aware of that, of what's really going on at a spiritual level, is what Paul's trying to get at here.
Yeah, absolutely. If somebody were to come in to try to dismantle our efforts in this congregation, how do you think that they would go about that? Would they not try to separate us from our eldership? Would they not try to discredit those that we look to lead us and to protect us and to guide us? I think that's what we see here with the false teachers coming in. Steve?
So I guess this is the obvious, but zeal in the service of a lie is a bad thing. And if anybody could speak to that, it'd been the Apostle Paul. I mean, if there was ever anyone zealous to destroy the way, it was him. I'd like to also make a comment about the earlier passages. Gospel preachers should not be loved or coddled after really at all any different than you would anybody else, certainly not because of their appearance or any other thing. But if you love gospel preachers, it should be because the gospel preacher preached the message of Christ, that he desired to study that and that's the reason. If I were ill or sick or had eye problems, they think Paul may have had eye problem, or some kind of infirmity of some kind like that, well, I'm be thankful for your concern and your love to try to help or to serve me, but that's not why. Paul's saying, I want you to love me because I have provided for you truth. And so if you want to be zealous about something, be zealous about that. Be zealous about truth.
Yeah, which is going to hold and carry over when Paul's not with them.
That's the thing that lasts forever. When I go back and I think about the great gospel preachers that I was blessed in my family to be able to entertain and to have in our homes and all, the things that I remember about them is how much desire they had for me and my family and all those came in contact with to obey the gospel first, but to go to heaven when they died. They stormed our will. They made us see past our, what I used to say, my own ignorance. And because of that, that's the reason why I love them, RJ. I can name them off, one right after the next.
Mm-hmm.
So this passage here for me is very, very important, not so much from the standpoint that, you would want to put away the elementary things of the law. And there's some great points to be made about that. Don't forget that the law is considered to be a sweet and savored thing. But not so much about that, but rather about this relationship with Paul to the church,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a very, very important thing for us to focus on.
Yeah. And to your point, I think when I think back to those who have been influential to me in teaching me the gospel, oftentimes some of the things that tend to stick with us the most are when they give you the examples that they've learned from, issues or problems or struggles that they've dealt with and learned from and how they've overcome those and saw the light in the gospel. And I think that's the same thing that Paul's doing with them. He's saying, become like me as I became like you, like we were talking about earlier. Paul, if anybody, would know about the zeal under a law, or a lie, as Steve said, because that's where he came from. There was nobody more zealous for the law of Moses than Paul was. And he left that. He left the enslavement under the law to be under Christ, to recognize that he is a son of promise, not a son of flesh. Okay, any more comments or questions through verse 18?
We got about 15 minutes, just a heads up.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at verses 19 and 20. My little children, for whom I am again in anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. What was the goal of the Judaizing teachers? What were they trying to accomplish here?
I think they were trying to add a requirement to a work needed to access God's grace, being circumcised or following the law.
Yeah, I think they took a lot of pride in their lineage, their idea that they were the nation of God, that the Jewish peoples were the nation of God, and they tied that to the works of the law. And their goal here with the Galatians was to really kind of dominate over them and to have them become their disciples. They wanted them to recognize that, hey, you can't truly be a son of God. You can't have a right relationship with God if you're not doing the same things that we're doing, right? They're trying to pull them away from that. Contrast to that, what was Paul's goal in his efforts with the Galatians? Look in verse 19. Yeah, that Christ be formed in them. Paul's goal isn't Paul-centered. It's not to do the things that Paul had to do in the past or anything like that. Paul's goal here is Christ-centered. He wants them to grow in the knowledge of Christ, for Christ to be fully formed in them. He's already done this once. He's already gone through this effort with them once, and he compares it to the labor in childbirth. Paul bore them until Christ was formed in them, and now he's having to do it all over again. And in verse 19, Paul expresses his desire to be with them so that he could be present so that he could present this message to them in a different tone. Why do you think that is? How would his tone be different if he was with them? I think when we look through this letter, the writing that we see, the language that he uses is at times harsh. It's very sharp and blunt and to the point. And he has to write like that. He has to be harsh and blunt with them so that they can see the seriousness of their condition. If he were with them in person, he could more easily express himself in a way that would cause them to understand the concern and the love that he has for them. It's like how things can get lost in translation when all you're doing is texting with somebody. They don't get the tone that your voice would carry along with that. You may be rebuking them, but the tone in your voice carries a tone of love and concern for them. Does that make sense? So he has to be more blunt and harsh in his writing just so that it comes across to them clearly that the state that they're in is not one that is in accordance with the Spirit of God. And he ends this section with, "For I am perplexed about you." He's at a loss in understanding their actions. How could they fall? How could they leave the law of Christ, leave the Spirit to become once again slaves and those in bondage? All right, thoughts through verse 20. Brian.
Well, Paul's goal ultimately is his original goal, and that is that they all enter into Christ to be united with Christ and become the children of God, and therefore there's equality among the children of God, that we all become one. There's neither free man or slave, there's no male or female. We're all one in Jesus Christ. And what he points out here by these Judaizing teachers, as you mentioned, their goal is not altruistic. Their goal is to make them their disciples and then have authority over the Gentiles. There'll be a caste system, if you will, and they're no longer all one. There'll still be Gentile Jew, which thwarts what Paul is telling them. And we'll get to it in these later verses that you're approaching, but we are the children of promise. We are the children of Abraham, chosen from the descendants of Isaac, not because of the bloodline of the flesh, but according to God's choice.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Steve?
I just wrote some things down here. I think it's important for us to understand 12 through 20 from the standpoint of a leader or a gospel preacher. Whoever it is that has the responsibility to tell forward the truth. Number one, that gospel preacher or leader must serve. He must love Jesus Christ. He must love the people. He must tell the truth. He must have zeal for good things, not just try to develop excitement in people. And he must form Jesus in them. That's really the outline of 12 through 20. And really it focuses on I think on gospel preachers and on elders, but even more so than that, it focuses on fathers in families. It focuses on mothers in their evangelistic efforts with their children. It focuses on opportunities that we might have in our communities by being a teacher in some, or even coaching baseball or football or whatever. This is really the outline of what he's trying to get across in 12 through 20. Let's be zealous about these things.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. We kind of come to a unique passage here where Paul just comes out and tells them that the story that he's going to reference in the Old Testament is an allegory that they can apply to their own lives. It's something that has a symbolic meaning. And I want to start with some context, which is ironic because, excuse me, Daniel went through some of this context in his lesson today as well. So some context to this. The story that Paul's going to focus on, excuse me, is that of Sarah and Hagar. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and Hagar, a bondservant to Sarah, and the sons that they bore for Abraham. Isaac of Sarah, Ishmael of Hagar. So some context leading up to that. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, God's call of Abraham, God says to him, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then we move ahead to Genesis chapter 15. We see God's covenant with Abraham. And verses 3 through 5. And Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." So here we see God's promise to Abraham that his heir, his descendants will come from his own son. And then in chapter 16, we see Sarah, the story of Sarah and Hagar. Hagar's introduced here. And instead of listening to the promise of God, they try to take it into their own hands and say, all right, well, we'll help God along in his own promise, which is obviously not the route that they should be taking. So verses 1 through 4. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. He had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And we move forward a few more verses. We see a promise that God gives to Hagar. So the angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be outnumbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So after Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarai becomes jealous and treats her harshly, and she kind of runs off to the side or runs away and is hurt because of this. And an angel of the Lord comes to her and says this to her. Then move forward to chapter 17, verses 15 through 21. We now see God's promise through Isaac. And God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Verse 19, God said, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." And then we come to the birth of Isaac in chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. And I'm going to move forward just a little bit here to move it along. And over in verses 18 through 21, here we see God's promises for Isaac and for Ishmael. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be displeased because of this day, or because of the boy, and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named." All right, we're going to go ahead and stop here. I want to spend just a few minutes on these verses on Wednesday. So I'll talk to Alex about that, because I think it's important to see this allegory that Paul lays out for the Galatian people, because it really ties into who they are and the question that they have to ask themselves: who are you? Are you a child of God, or are you a child of the law? And that's what he's going to present to them. So thank you for your time today.